You're watching Open Agenda. Here's our host, Joe White.
Welcome to Open Agenda. I'm your host, Joe White. I'm joined today with our executive producer, Joe Venosa. Joe, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Joe.
So you were at the county council meeting on Tuesday, September 3rd. I want to talk a little bit in this show about what you saw there. We did get the ballot question, the wording for the Charter Amendment A for November. I'd like to discuss that issue and why we're working on this so hard. I also know that you've been monitoring an email that you have set up for county employees who've been reaching out to us anyway about some of the abuses in the executive office that they've been feeling, and that's their opinion. And I want to talk about that, maybe how that process is either broken down or should work anyway. But before we get into all that, let's talk about the county council meeting on September 3rd. It was a 6 p.m. meeting.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what you saw and what some of the hearings that they went over.
Sure. Well, it was a very well-attended meeting. I think a large part of that was because several issues obviously were discussed. Now, they passed, I believe, 3 resolutions regarding things that were on the agenda, one of which was to accept grant money for the airport extension, which is a sort of long-term process.
They've been working on this for many years.
Correct. Yeah. This is sort of an ongoing process. The other included the moving of an easement for environmental protection to a particular lot, I believe on the east side of the county.
And this was for a development.
Correct.
So basically, when a developer wants to put in a road that might run through a natural area, they then have to find an easement in another part of the county to replicate that, replace it, so to speak.
Correct. And then the third thing was the acceptance. It was a resolution to accept grant money. I'm sorry, it was a resolution to accept a donation for the Parsonsburg Library project.
And that came from the library's reserve fund,
yeah.
and it's where they do collect donations for such things.
Correct.
And this isn't going to fully fund that renovation for the building in Parsonsburg. But
No, it certainly helps, and all 3 of those resolutions passed with, I believe, unanimous approval, and it was, yeah.
And the public could have spoken at any of those hearings, but no one did.
On those particular hearings, they did not speak, although a few people did attend and spoke about the sort of ongoing issue, I guess you could say, regarding Barron Creek Road, where there are citizens who now, kind of after the fact, have requested that the county look into reopening it.
So I've been looking into the history of that issue, and I mean, obviously the storm that took out Barron Creek was back in 2016. In that time, we've had 3 different county executives, one of which, Bob Culver, actually made it a point to rebuild that road. The county, our citizens, we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on engineering plans to have that road rebuilt. Now, obviously, it would take the State Highway Administration and their kind of money, their kind of budget to do it. But it hasn't been done, and has been left off the capital improvement project of the current executive. Not with any public hearings or anything, but it's just not there. And then the county council took it off the priority letter to the State Highway Administration.
Right. And then again, which means that therefore that the state, if they know that we're not really going to be prioritizing it, then why should they?
Yeah.
And so the interrelationship between state and local funding is always sort of a complicated dance.
Yeah. It was nice, though, that the folks, whether it was someone who spoke out against it or someone who spoke out for it, I mean, they had a forum to make their voices heard. Yeah. These letters go out once a year. I mean, there's a time and place where this could be brought back up, especially if it's important to the folks on the west side of the county. There were a lot of folks there who made some good points to have it, and a lot that made some good points that it doesn't need to be.
It's a classic local government issue.
Yeah, it was great to see it out in the open and in the public.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, we're both very much in favor of this Charter Amendment A. We've made that very clear because we've been attending these meetings and we've seen the lack of transparency that has come out of not just this executive's office. It's hard when you hear that. It's like it's somewhat personal. It's not. I mean, this goes back to Rick Pilot, Bob Culver, and even to some degree John Posota. The essence of that office just doesn't breed transparency. And I thought you could speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think 20 years ago when this experiment began, there was a hope among some. And again, I think it was a good faith effort at the time that thought you could create a county executive position that would be a check on a county council's set of policies. The problem is if you actually look at how our specific county executive office was created and how it's embedded now in the county charter, it was given a real lack of oversight to the extent that you, in many ways, I would argue, you to some extent have sort of dueling local government entities rather than just separate branches of government.
Well, talk a little bit about the difference between checks and balances and separation of powers.
Sure.
Because the folks who are on the other side of this keep acting like they're one and the same, but they're actually not.
Right, and let's understand that, you know, the classic Enlightenment era concept of a check and balance, which is ironically based on Newtonian physics, is that, you know, for every action you have an equal opposite reaction, and then that will kind of check itself if you distill that concept to a governmental system. Now, the problem is, for 140 years, and this is true of most communities throughout the United States, they are councilmatic forms of government, in part because at the county level, you have a fundamental situation in which you have multiple people who have to build consensus with public oversight over getting a majority of votes and for pushing policy. The executive position, as we've created it, essentially doesn't so much serve as a check on a council, but it is sort of, in some ways, as I said, a sort of parallel institution where for personnel matters, for a lot of hiring issues, for many of the offices and divisions in the county, the executive office runs with a kind of autonomy that really doesn't actually have anything to do with a traditional check and balance. It's a separation of powers, but it's a separation of powers without any real transparency in the executive office.
So how would it be different if we're able to return to a county manager form of government?
Sure. Well, in a councilmatic form of government where you have a manager, there are two important things. One is that you actually have to have a consensus of elected officials who agree on who that county manager would be. Okay, so it's not as if you know, one person can sort of demand or push an agenda. It would be someone who is the consensus choice among a group of equals that we represent, that we elect to represent us. And almost always, those managers have to have certain professional qualifications. They often, for example, have to have a background in public policy, in budgeting, meaning we don't just entrust our liberties, our budgets to somebody who just decides to run for office without any qualification beyond maybe having a lot of friends.
Yeah, I mean, even business experience doesn't necessarily translate into a successful executive, and we've already witnessed this in this county.
And that's what's interesting is that, you know, and I believe you've made this point before, and others have too. We've had 4 very different county executives, different parties, different philosophies, different professions and trainings. They've all, to some extent, unfortunately, have proven that this has been a very disastrous experiment in many ways for county life. If you talk to people that have lived here most of their lives, I think they'd be hard-pressed to sort of be able to definitively tell you how has this position positively impacted the community.
Well, when we come back, we actually want to talk about part of the community that's not been able to speak out, and that is the county employees that have reached out to us. And then in the last segment, I'd like for you and I to spend some time to talk about some of the characteristics we witnessed at the county council meetings that led us to make the decision to support Charter Amendment A this November for both of us. We'll be right back after this. Stay with us.
Nanticoke Harbor is located on the Nanticoke River, about 20 miles west of Salisbury. This facility has 2 concrete boat ramps, 68 boat slips, and abundant trailer parking. Year-round, seasonal, and daily boat slip rentals are available. You'll also find a picnic area and pavilion offering amazing views of the harbor entrance and river, a small beach area, and good fishing. Nanticoke Harbor is situated almost right next door to the popular Roaring Point Park, which makes it a convenient place to launch your boat to spend the day at the beach. A variety of commercial workboats are docked in the harbor, which ply the Nanticoke River for oysters, crabs, and fish. Opposite the boat ramp, you'll notice several small buildings which, in days gone by, were part of the H.B. Kennerly and Sons seafood processing facility. Founded in 1935, H.B. Kennerly was once Wicomico County's largest employer, building its business on processing the oysters that were once so abundant in the Nanticoke River. They also processed breaded squid and clam strips, as well as tuna delivered on ships from South America. Oysters were king on this part of the Nanticoke River until the mid-1980s, when two oyster diseases known as MSX and Dermo decimated oyster populations throughout the Chesapeake Bay. Sadly, after 50 years in business, the Kennerlys had to close the plant's doors because so few oysters remained. However, they left behind a legacy of oyster farming, which they had pioneered years before and has since been revived. You'll notice several large plastic tanks at the water's edge in the harbor, which are used for growing juvenile oysters known as spat. The tanks are first filled with cleaned oyster shells, which are immersed in a constant flow of water pumped out of the harbor. Then, a muddy mass of microscopic oyster larvae is placed into the tank. After a short while, the oyster larvae attach themselves to the clean shells and they begin to grow. The oyster shells peppered with spat are purchased by watermen who then plant them on leased beds out in the river where they can grow to market size. After a year or two, the mature oysters are harvested and returned once again to Nanticoke Harbor, where they're offloaded and shipped by truck to processing and distribution facilities. On any given day, you'll see oyster dredging and tonging boats go in and out of the harbor as they pursue their daily tasks of planting and harvesting oysters. Thankfully, the oyster population in the Nanticoke River is rebounding, and with good stewardship combined with modern oyster farming techniques, it is our hope that Maryland's ancient tradition of seafood harvesting will forever remain a part of what defines Wicomico County. Additional information about Nanticoke Harbor and boat slip rentals is available on the Wicomico County Department of Recreation, Parks, and Tourism website. This is Mike Goldberg for Open Agenda. Back to you, Joe.
Welcome back to Open Agenda. I'm here again with our executive producer, Joe Venosa. So, Joe, back in the spring when our group, that's not so small as we've been characterized, right? We're a very diverse group. But when we first started to form, because we finally had this inclination that it was time to give the voters, the 40% that weren't here 18 years ago, a fresh chance to voice their opinion on whether we should be councilmatic or executive. You started an email that allowed county employees who we know for sure have been silent by not just this county executive but other ones. You started an email, and I want to hear a little bit about what you've been finding through that communication with them.
Sure. Well, many moons ago, and in the beginning of this experience, before our show, obviously, there were already a lot of widespread discussions among county employees who had experienced varying degrees of bullying, pressure. Some have, put it straight out as harassment, and to some extent outright threats on their job security. And when you're in a community like ours, we all know each other to some extent, or somebody knows somebody that we know, and those kinds of stories circulate very quickly. And what was troubling was that our county executive system that we currently have doesn't have a real process, a true process, where county employees can really address grievances.
Well, I disagree with you here. I think they do. I think the hard thing that I've heard is that the county executive is part of this process, which is
but
makes it tough.
Well,
right?
therein lies my point.
Okay.
Is that the existence of that negates the whole idea that you could actually have an objective, workable system for grievances.
So Anjali Chantel, she is the county auditor. She does not work for the executive necessarily or the county council. She is basically there to make sure that everything's on the up and up. Uh, she has brought up that just recently, she has just, and this maybe in the last year, really trying to get the hotline back up and going. But that appeals process still involves the same people, or some of the same people who maybe have the grievances against, right?
Correct. Correct. If you are an employee, okay, and you are essentially worrying about feeding your family, right, keeping health insurance, protecting your own financial interests, mortgages, things like that, you unfortunately are increasingly in a position where you might not be able to do much if you are the target of some kind of persecution.
Especially if it's done through a supervisory position and not a direct threat.
Correct. Correct.
So.
And unfortunately, and the email that we established, which is countyexecutiveabuses@gmail.com, was put out there to provide people the ability to anonymously provide information. And this is information that has also been sent to other members of the council, to other state authorities in some instances if they're egregious enough. But it really is an opportunity for people to provide a little bit of a voice for what they're going through.
So when we look back at our last episode, we spoke a lot about Mike Goldberg and his legal fight. When you see just how quickly a disagreement, and you can make your own opinion, but you can't make your own facts. The facts were about campaign contributions from an internet, Facebook and entity that were the information was disseminated that was different. That there was no donation, but in fact there was.
Right.
When you see that even though that you have the factual information and you don't make any aggressive moves, and you still see that you can be persecuted as an employee,
even more so,
right?
Even more so.
Yeah.
And again, one of the things that unfortunately has come up time and time again in these email confessions, frankly, that's what it sort of feels like. They're confessing some of their biggest fears and stresses, is the idea that the supervisors are also aware of the pressure they're being put in on employees. And so imagine you have underfunded, underutilized departments where people have either quit, been made to retire, in some cases, been given heavy-handed suggestions as to what they should do on a policy. And so as a supervisor, you're caught in a really tough spot because you're trying to maybe protect certain employees from the pressures of the executive's office, or you could have your agenda that maybe you were willing to push.
Well, let's talk about one example in particular.
Yeah.
Let's say you're a county landfill employee, and so your job is to work at the landfill. May even be at the quarry site on Conley Mill Road, which is supposed to be a park in the future. And an MOU gets signed with an outside marketing company to have a safari at the quarry. But equipment is moved over, as an example, if equipment was moved over and utilized in an inappropriate way, and you want to raise your hand, but the thought of doing that may actually impact the ability for you to have a career. Under what circumstances should you do it?
Well, that's the thing. You have no real recourse because even the official proper channel that is supposedly implemented is run by those very same people that have all of the agenda to prevent that from happening.
I will say, I have the utmost respect for Anjali Shintel. Listen to her, not just talk about HR issues, it could be budgetary issues. Someone who has just a lot of credibility, a lot of respect. The one thing that she has brought up is if anyone has a direct knowledge or direct issue, to email her. She's not an HR director.
Correct.
Not
correct.
saying that.
I will tell you, though, that on several occasions, employees have told me both via email and also one-on-one, and this can certainly be confirmed by other elected officials, that there is a fear to even do that because there's a fear that the county executive's office is actually mining the emails of any county employee who makes contact with other entities such as the internal auditor.
Well, when there were false accusations leveled against Mike Goldberg, Open Agenda was there with the evidence and the backing. and I would put it out there. We would do the same. So
Yeah.
I hope anyone who reaches out to you,
Yeah.
let us know.
Yeah.
We're most certainly will honor your commitment to be anonymous, but if you have the guts, if you have the determination to not be,
Yeah.
we're going to vet the process. We do not just work off a hearsay.
Correct. Trust but verify.
Trust but verify, for sure. Now, if we go back to a council manager form of government, how would this be different?
Oh, it'd be incredibly different. For starters, you actually have policies in place that aren't determined by one particular executive who puts in political appointees. You see, the beauty of a council-manager form of government is that, for example, let's say you have a manager that might be involved in some kind of personnel issue with employees. The council, right, as a matter of having a consensus, open, transparent system, can investigate, it can ask questions, it can request documents. It provides a level of protection to those employees that you don't have right now, where basically you have the fox guarding the hen house.
I think this matter needs some more attention shined on it. I'm glad to see that Mike Goldberg was vindicated, and I want us to be able to be that voice for some other people, and I hope that they have the courage, if they're able, to come out and speak.
Yeah, and on that note, I just want to say to anybody who might be watching this and who is going through that you know, when your family is on the line, when you're trying to put food on the table, and you have this kind of pressure to just do your job, and it's being interfered with in this way, my heart goes out to them, because I've always believed the best way you can tell somebody's character is how they treat those below them, right? If you're a manager, a supervisor, or an executive, and you treat people who make this county operate in such a terrible way, I can find nothing lower than someone like that.
Yeah. Or calling someone small.
Or
right?
calling someone small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So after we return from our break, Joe and I are going to spend a couple minutes explaining to each other and to you exactly what our goals are for the November referendum and what we hope to see for the county politics in Wicomico County. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you for joining us again here at Open Agenda. I'm your host, Joe White. Joe Venosa, thanks for sticking around for the last segment.
Thank you, sir.
So you and I have been public and present at several county council meetings, and we have a strong opinion about voting for Charter Amendment A in November. What is it that drives you to stick your neck out there and to be part of this?
Yeah, it's a great question, because my wife always keeps me on my toes on this issue. We'll sometimes joke. She'll say, "Look, I could understand marital infidelity. I could understand alcohol and drug abuse, but county politics? Why do this, right?" And maybe it's a little bit Pollyannish of me to sort of say it in this way, but it's what I feel. The things that happen locally in your local government, your local community, affect you the most. Now, I've been here in the community for only about a decade, but I've transitioned in that period from, a relatively young guy starting a career to now a father and getting into middle age. And I've watched with my own eyes, and I've watched, through my son, who's dependent on community services and the community institutions, what happens. And unfortunately, I don't like what I see sometimes. And so much of the drama, the gridlock that has happened in the last, particularly, I would say 5 to 6 years, seems to be pointed at what's going on at the upper echelons of our county government.
You brought that up about the local side of this, and I would argue that your local politics have more impact on your day-to-day life than what's on the national news.
Yeah.
The national politics are important.
Yeah.
But from a broad stroke standpoint,
Schools, infrastructure, healthcare,
property taxes,
job market, those are local realities.
But even some of the rhetoric that's come on the side for folks who don't want to support this charter amendment, their livelihoods, their careers are tied to it from a political aspiration side.
Yeah.
Are yours?
In the sense that I care about the future of our county if it has good government.
Yes.
I guess you could say that. But I'm not running for office. I'm not planning on running for office. I'm a teacher. I live in the community, and it's something that I personally see every day in the life that I lead. And so, in a sense, that's what motivated me to do this, because I don't have to worry, for example, right now, if a county executive wants me to lose my job. And so when you're in a little bit of a position of privilege, I think you have a responsibility to speak up to those things.
So after this referendum, whether we vote to go back to County Matic form of government or Council Matic form of government, or continue with the executive, is it going to change how you're going to approach what you do at the county council meetings after that?
The basic expectations and goals are the same. Have an open, transparent form of government, try to produce progress with results, and ultimately, when people are locked out of power and influence in their own government, to try to speak up for those people. It's, again, maybe it's a corny concept, but I've always believed that we have to look out for each other.
Yeah.
And whether that's your neighbor who's going through a hard time, or your county government who might be doing things that you think are harming other people.
I look back at the history of this nation, and you and I are both very much into history, political history as much as anything.
Sure.
It must have been such a bold maneuver just shortly after the American Revolution to actually sit around and go, well, we're glad the king is gone, but this form of government, the Articles of Confederation, don't work. And they went up to Philadelphia again.
Yeah.
I mean, they went up to Philadelphia at one point as traitors to the king.
Yep.
They could have been hung. They could have lost their land. They stood up for what they believed.
Yep.
And then even after they did that, they took a step back and said, you know what?
Yep.
This isn't right yet.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's where we're at. And as important as local politics are for our everyday, whether it's schools or property tax or your ability to have a well-paying job in this county, it's really important to say, hey, taking a step to evaluate where we're at is not a misstep.
Right.
Whether this amendment passes or not,
Correct.
this is part of active government.
And that's what's interesting about this whole experience, right? Is that there seems to be attacks coming from people who are offended or angry at even the idea that we should have a vote on this.
Yeah, that is very concerning.
And it's a telling thing, too. It says a lot about, I think, where some people are coming from.
We're going to see this more. I mean, I think you and I are both prepared for the next 8 weeks for the rhetoric to enhance. There's some folks, particularly our county executive, who are fighting for a job.
Who has political ambitions tied to that job.
But I think, there's no fault in thinking that, hey, look, everybody's going to defend their interest. But at the end of the day, we're going to take a stand. So thanks for being here today. Thanks for taking the time to talk about this.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this episode. When we return next week, we are going to talk about the county council meeting that is scheduled for Tuesday, September 17th at 10 a.m. We don't have an agenda yet, but we will by our next episode. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend.
I know what I'm doing, man.